Military procurement and acquisitions officers use the term corporate partners when describing the defense corporations and contractors that provide them with what they need to protect America. It's a symbiotic relationship. Since 1800, when Henry Foxhall built the Columbia Foundry and signed the first contracts to manufacture cannons, the U.S. military has been reliant on defense companies for weapons and equipment. That reality generally gives the Pentagon the advantage in terms of compliance and the other things associated with keeping the customer happy. During my Navy career, I saw two examples of that. The first was in 1986 when then Secretary of the Navy John Lehman wanted to make the point that he didn't need but one defense company to provide carrier air wings with the planes required, and he ordered the USS John F. Kennedy to go to sea with what he called an all-Grumman air wing. And then a few years later, then Secretary of Defense Richard Cheney, unimpressed by Grumman's cocky attitude following years of domination in building the lion's share of carrier-based aircraft, canceled both the Tomcat and Intruder and shifted the balance of contracts to McDonnell Douglas, which was about to get acquired by Boeing, to build more Hornets. But these days, there's a company that sells to the Department of Defense that's flipped the script in terms of who works for who, and that's SpaceX. SpaceX was founded in 2002 by Elon Musk, the serial entrepreneur and tech guru whose genius is only matched by his lack of social skills. Some reports have claimed that he suffers from a degree of Asperger's, and strong points of view that make him hard to work with or for. He co-founded one of the first federally insured online banks, which eventually featured a money transfer service known as PayPal. Although he was ousted as CEO in 2000, 2 years later, as an 11% shareholder, he earned the first part of his fortune, $176 million, when PayPal was acquired by eBay. Musk's interest in space started during his childhood in South Africa. He was raised mostly by a strict, if not abusive, father and learned to escape through voracious reading of fantasy and science fiction books and video games. He didn't thrive in a structured school environment, but demonstrated an exceptional aptitude for engineering, which would serve him well when he later directed his energy towards the aerospace and automotive industries. After the PayPal acquisition, he focused on space, getting involved with a not-for-profit dedicated to reaching Mars, and even traveling to Russia to buy used ICBMs for conversion to space transport vehicles. The Russians didn't take him seriously, so he decided to fund his own company to build affordable rockets to reach Mars. And $100 million of his own money later, SpaceX was born with Musk as the CEO and chief engineer. His timing was ideal in that NASA was several decades past the Cold War-era space race that saw the agency flush with cash and talent. After the shuttle program ended, NASA found itself without a means to get astronauts and payloads to and from the International Space Station, except if they partnered with the Russians, which worked in times of relative détente but was otherwise suboptimum. Enter SpaceX, NASA's lower-cost, higher-tech option. In 2006, the company was awarded a Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program contract, and after 3 failed attempts of their Falcon 1 rocket that nearly caused Musk and his companies to go bankrupt, he succeeded in launching one into orbit in 2008. Later that year, SpaceX received a $1.6 billion commercial resupply services contract from NASA for 12 flights of its Falcon 9 rocket and Dragon spacecraft to the International Space Station. In 2012, the Dragon vehicle docked with the ISS, a first for a commercial spacecraft. Musk pioneered the use of reusable rockets, one of the technologies SpaceX has developed to keep the costs down, and the concept was proved out when the first stage of a Falcon 9 landed on a platform in 2015. In 2020, SpaceX launched its first crewed flight, the Demo 2, becoming the first private company to place astronauts into orbit and dock a crewed spacecraft with the ISS. SpaceX has also carried military payloads for the Pentagon, and in 2018, the company signed a $1.8 billion contract with the National Reconnaissance Office to build a spy satellite network called Starshield that leverages the technology in Starlink, SpaceX's low Earth orbit commercial satellite system. Somewhat ironically, it is Starlink that has created the Pentagon's greatest concerns about being over-leveraged against the tech of a single vendor and the unpredictable whims of that vendor's founder and CEO. But before we go into the details of that situation, let's review the basics of satellite technology. The first is geostationary orbit, which puts satellites 22,000 miles above the Earth traveling at Mach 9 to stay in a fixed position over the equator. The advantage of that orbit is that once a satellite is there, it will stay there permanently. Also, because the satellite is so far away from Earth, it can cover a wide range, so global coverage can be generated using as few as 3 or 4 of them. The disadvantage is that because it's so far away, it causes performance issues and upwards of 280 milliseconds of latency, which doesn't sound like a long time, but can be depending on the military application. We'll skip over medium Earth orbit, but just mention that that's where the GPS satellites are, and jump right to low Earth orbit, which is where the Starlink satellites are. The advantage of low Earth orbit is low latency, as short as 20 milliseconds, and better image resolution than geostationary satellites because of the much closer proximity to Earth. The disadvantage is to stay in low Earth orbit, the satellites need to travel at Mach 25, faster than the rotation of the Earth, which requires ion thrusters to accomplish, and that coverage is narrow and always moving, which requires a lot more satellites to match what geostationary orbit satellites can cover. The Starlink system was created by launching rockets with 60 satellites, each weighing about 1,800 pounds, inside the nose fairing at a time. The satellites deploy in low Earth orbit, about 342 miles away, and form into a constellation with low latency, high resolution, but limited and moving coverage. Global coverage is a function of multiple constellations that SpaceX deployed to create a web that allows users on the ground to bounce between constellations seamlessly as they pass overhead faster than the rotation of the Earth. As of right now, there are 5,504 Starlink satellites in orbit, of which 5,442 are operational. According to Space.com, Musk built Starlink to capture part of the estimated $1 trillion worldwide internet connectivity market to help fund his Mars colonization vision. The FCC has granted SpaceX permission to fly 12,000 Starlink satellites, and the company has also filed paperwork with an international regulator to launch up to 30,000 additional spacecraft. To put that into perspective, as of November 7, 2022, only 14,450 satellites have ever been launched in history, with 6,800 currently active. SpaceX currently has a monopoly on the low Earth orbit internet connectivity market. When the Russians invaded Ukraine in late February of 2022, they also launched a coordinated series of cyber attacks in an attempt to cripple Ukrainian infrastructure. In an article in The New Yorker, investigative journalist Ronan Farrow writes that Ukrainian officials and a loose coalition of expatriates in the tech sector found a potential solution in Starlink. The tripod-mounted dishes, each about the size of a computer display and clad in the white plastic reminiscent of the sleek design sensibility of Musk's Tesla electric cars, connect with the low Earth orbit satellite constellations. The units have limited range, but in this situation, that was an advantage. Although a nationwide network of dishes was required, it would be difficult for Russia to completely dismantle Ukrainian connectivity. A soldier in Ukraine's Signal Corps who was responsible for maintaining Starlink access on the front lines and who asked to only be identified by his first name, Mykola, told Farrow it's the essential backbone of communications on the battlefield. It's also key to flying drones, where low latency is crucial for pilots attempting to precisely maneuver the unmanned aircraft from remote locations. In the New Yorker feature, Farrow writes that initially Musk showed unreserved support for the Ukrainian cause, but as the war ground on, SpaceX began to balk at the cost. SpaceX's director of government sales told the Pentagon in a letter in September of 2022, "We are not in a position to further donate terminals to Ukraine or fund the existing terminals for an indefinite period of time." Musk was also growing increasingly uneasy with the fact that his technology was being used for warfare. That month, at a conference in Aspen attended by business and political figures, Musk even appeared to express support for Vladimir Putin. Reid Hoffman, who helped start PayPal, recalled that Musk was on stage and he said, "We should be negotiating. Putin wants peace." Farrow writes that a week later, Musk tweeted a proposal for his own peace plan, which called for new referendums to redraw the borders of Ukraine and granted Russia control of Crimea, the semi-autonomous peninsula recognized by most nations, including the U.S., as Ukrainian territory. In later tweets, Musk portrayed as inevitable an outcome favoring Russia and attached maps highlighting eastern Ukrainian territories, some of which he argued prefer Russia. Remember, Musk owns Twitter, which he rebranded as X. At the same time, Musk pulled the Starlink plug on the Ukrainian forces in direct contact with Russian forces. Mykola, the Ukrainian Signal Corps soldier, told Farrow, "We were very close to the front line. We crossed this border and the Starlink stopped working. Communications became dead. Units were isolated. When you're on offense, especially for commanders, you need a constant stream of information from battalions. Commanders had to drive to the battlefield to be in radio range, risking themselves. It was chaos." The Financial Times reported that Starlink outages affected units in Kherson, Zaporizhia, Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Luhansk. American and Ukrainian officials told Farrow that they believed that SpaceX had cut the connectivity via geofencing, cordoning off areas of access. A senior Pentagon official said, quote, "We had a whole series of meetings internal to the department to try to figure out what we could do about this," end quote. Carroll writes that Musk's singular role presented unfamiliar challenges, as did the government's role as intermediary. The Pentagon official added, quote, "It wasn't like we could hold him in breach of contract or something," end quote. The Pentagon would need to reach a contractual agreement with SpaceX so that, at the very least, Musk, as the Pentagon official put it, quote, "couldn't wake up one morning and just decide he didn't want to do this anymore," end quote. Farrell writes that typically such a negotiation would be handled by the Pentagon's acquisitions department, but Musk had become more than just a vendor like Boeing, Lockheed, or other defense industry behemoths. So in October of 2022, Musk got a personal call from the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Once handlers were able to get Musk on the line, the Undersecretary's tone was deferential. He thanked Musk for his efforts in Ukraine, acknowledged the steep costs he'd incurred, and pleaded for even a few weeks to devise a contract. But he was firm at the end of the conversation, and he told Musk that shutting off Starlink wouldn't end the war, but would just cause more casualties. Apparently, Musk wasn't convinced. The Undersecretary told Farrow that he sensed that Musk was getting nervous that Starlink's involvement was increasingly seen in Russia as enabling the Ukrainian war effort, and he was looking for a way to placate Russian concerns. Musk also volunteered that he had spoken with Putin personally and had regular consultations with the Kremlin. On the phone with the Undersecretary, Musk said that he was looking at his laptop and could see the entire war unfolding through a map of Starlink activity, and that gave him a vivid illustration of how technology he had designed for peaceful ends was being used to wage war. At the end of the 15-minute call with the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Musk agreed to give the Pentagon more time. He also, after public blowback and with evident annoyance, walked back his threats to cut off service. "To hell with it," he tweeted. "Even though Starlink is still losing money and other companies are getting billions of taxpayer dollars, we'll just keep funding the Ukrainian government for free." In June of 2023, the Department of Defense announced that it had reached a deal with SpaceX, although the terms of that deal have not been made public. In the meantime, Ukrainian officials say that they have not faced further service interruptions. But as Farrow writes, Musk has continued to express ambivalence about how his technology is being used and where it can be deployed. In an exchange with Scott Kelly, astronaut and fighter pilot I flew with in VF-143 in the early 90s, who was on Twitter petitioning Musk to restore full functionality of Starlink, Musk replied, "We will not enable escalation of conflict that may lead to World War III." Of course, this example is a very specific one-off. The war in Ukraine doesn't involve America sending troops, but rather gear and money. And as the amount grows without changing the calculus on the battlefield, it has created political pressure for the Pentagon, currently led by a retired U.S. Army four-star, who remains convinced that if the Ukrainians don't stop the Russians, eventually the American military will have to. So in the face of dwindling funds, off-the-shelf capability like Starlink is crucial for the Ukrainian war effort. And of course, Elon Musk is not your typical defense company CEO. As Farrow writes in summary, Musk has become a hyper-exposed pop culture figure, and his sharp turns from altruistic to vainglorious, strategic to impulsive, have been the subject of massive media coverage. Musk's own tweets since he took over Twitter have demonstrated he's willing to provoke a large segment of the American public under the auspices of his concept of free speech, and that willingness concerns the powers that be in places like the Pentagon, who prefer their corporate partners to be more low-key and predictable. But the situation is also a cautionary tale about DoD's growing dependence on outsourced capabilities. It's worth noting that SpaceX is building Starshield, but once it's complete, they won't own it. The National Reconnaissance Office will. That's the main difference between that and Starlink. And as the Pentagon considers the liabilities of their specific dependencies on the eccentricities of the flawed genius that is Elon Musk, that's no minor thing. All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything going forward. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please consider using the super thanks, the heart icon below, or become a patron at patreon.com/wardcarroll. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.